How interesting.
Who doesn't love a film with a little bit of action and bloodshed? Most such films fall under the genre of sword and sorcery and are usually characterized by, as some might say, babes, beasts, and blood. Popularized by the cult classic Conan the Barbarian, these movies gained prominence sometime during the early 80s. Following the unprecedented success of Conan, theaters were suddenly flooded with a multitude of B-grade campy copies that were trying their best to outdo the doer and carve a space for themselves in the box office records. Although they received mixed results when they did release, some of them were just so wacky and silly that they have cemented a place for themselves in the world of sword and sorcery cinema. Let us know down in the comments if you've ever come across any of these movies and which ones were your favorite, and if not, maybe you can add them to your list for an entertaining and racy movie night. Now, let's get into it. Before we get into our explanation though, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Conan the Barbarian, 1982. A lot of you might not know this, but Conan the Barbarian was actually proposed all the way back in 1970, but for some inexplicable reason, the idea didn't quite pull through then. Fast forward to 1982, when the makers of the movie had a certified hit on their hands. Was it all thanks to Arnold Schwarzenegger's undeniable charm, or was it something else? We think people just really want to see some good old-fashioned sword swinging, but we'll never know the truth for sure. The film primarily follows a barbarian named Conan, obviously, who's on a bloodthirsty quest for vengeance. His target? An evil cult leader who has murdered his entire family. Right from the outset, we bet you can imagine just how gory this movie is about to get. Well, on his quest, he bumps into a bunch of warriors, wizards, and women, characters who make his story all the more exciting. The entire redemption arc is detailed through his tragic childhood, torturous youth, and his eventual revenge. Events that would form the skeleton of almost every other sword and sorcery movie that was released after this point. But like they say, you can never outdo the doer. Although some believe that Conan didn't exactly have the most stellar, commercially adaptable plotline, its brutish and bloody undertones are what made it such a hit. Arnold Schwarzenegger was a newcomer who did a stellar job, and the plotline he was working with was unapologetically R-rated, guaranteeing the movie's cult classic status. Flesh plus Blood, 1985. More popularly known as Flesh and Blood, this 1985 sword and sorcery film plays out like a romance plus historical adventure. What many of you might not know is that the draft titles for this movie included God's Own Butchers and The Rose and the Sword, and that this was initially pieced together using the material that was scrapped from a Dutch TV show called Floris. That's an insane way to start making a movie. The plot revolves around a bunch of mercenaries who set out on a mission appointed to them by some lord who is afraid of losing his lordship, but their quest turns out to be much more than they bargained for, and the journey is fraught with betrayal and tragedy. One of the most disturbing parts of the film is a scene where a revenge attack plays out, and we think it's safe to say that it changes the trajectory of the rest of the movie. Why? Well, to begin with, they abduct a beautiful young princess who's already engaged, and obviously, introducing a gorgeous girl into a group of rowdy, hot-blooded men is bound to cause some friction. The movie was a massive flop with the audiences, and many believed it was because the main plot of the film was lost to the more romantic angle they ultimately chose to take. The lead actor thought that this served as a reminder never to compromise on the quality of his product under peer pressure. Despite its box office failure, it went on to become a highly rated cult classic that stood the test of time. But be warned, if you choose to watch this film, you'll be subjected to a bunch of really disturbing R-rated material, including some scenes of assault with the poor abducted princess. It's pretty upsetting stuff, but that's what makes this a movie experience unlike any other, and a standout in the genre. Excalibur. This iconic, epic medieval sword and sorcery film was released all the way back in 1981 and has been credited for launching the careers of many big names in the industry, including the likes of Liam Neeson and Patrick Stewart. Named after King Arthur's infamous sword, the movie retells the story of the king and his Knights of the Round Table, albeit in a much more artistic fashion than ever before. Taking inspiration from Le Morte d'Arthur, a 15th century romance novel, the film was a standout in the sword and sorcery genre. It originally began development as a sort of offshoot of Lord of the Rings, but later took on a life of its own, and for good reason. Because most of the films were shot in and around Ireland, they're considered to be flag bearers of the development and popularization of the Irish film industry. And here's a fun fact for you. A lot of you might not know this, but this film was initially released as a 140-minute long R-rated cut that seemingly had a lot of graphic intimacy and a ton of violence. So if you ever doubt its inclusion in such a bloody genre, think again. Now, all wasn't well when it was first released in theaters. Many were quick to criticize the film's plot, with others claiming that the characters strayed far from their original versions. Many others were less critical, praising the film's unique take and immense visual appeal. We know that those might not necessarily be the characteristics you look for in a movie of this genre, but we still urge you to give this one a shot. Highlander, 1986. This fantasy action film was the first of the iconic series and also a really cool collaboration done by the American and British film industries. Released in 1986, the film followed an intense war that waged between the immortals of the world, all through a dizzying mix of what happened in the past and how it affected the present. That's a pretty risky plot for a genre like sword and sorcery, wouldn't you say? Well, the audiences seem to think so too, and the movie bombed dismally on its initial release. But that wasn't the end of it. Its unique take on such a typical genre spread like wildfire in film circles, and it became an underground cult classic. Its popularity boomed to such a great extent that fans even got a bunch of film sequels and TV spin-offs. Imagine all of that coming from a movie that was a supposed box office bomb. Now, although this might not seem that gory, everyone who's an avid fan of the show knows that the original plot was way darker, and that's saying quite a bit. It also incorporated a lot of violence that had to be cut for commercial viability. The movie captured a ton of gorgeous scenery from the Scottish landscapes and also panned its way to New York's concrete jungles. A true British-American blend, isn't it? Although a lot of this movie is style over substance, this dark horse of a film is a must-watch for lovers of the genre. The Sword and the Sorcerer, 1982. The very creatively titled The Sword and the Sorcerer from 1982 took the world by storm by following closely in the footsteps of the oh-so-popular Conan, albeit with a much more saucy storyline. Throughout the film, we follow a young and handsome mercenary who wields quite a dangerous sword. With his three-bladed projectile weapon named Talon, he digs deep into his royal family line and sets off to save a princess who's being used as a puppet by an evil dictator and a powerful sorcerer. He fights off the villains and rescues the princess, all in a bid to win one night in bed with her. Pretty steamy intentions, right? He's just a young, hot-blooded man after all. Initially released to mixed reviews from audiences and critics alike, the movie soon gained mainstream popularity and ticket sales soared at the box office. This also prompted the release of a sequel. It was so popular, in fact, the film became the most commercially successful indie film from 1982, raking in almost 10 times its budget in profits. The Barbarians, 1987. The Barbarians took Conan's macho manliness to the next level by featuring not one, but two whole Conan lookalikes with half the original's acting chops. Their acting was so bad, in fact, that the two actors were nominated for the Golden Raspberry Award for the Worst New Stars. This 1987 Italian-American co-production takes us on a wild ride with these two Conan dupes journeying through Rome dressed in elaborate costumes and surrounded by detailed sets. These two aspects certainly helped the movie look okay, but what failed miserably was the dialogue, making the ultimate product seem like a jumbled mess of the worst and best aspects of its production. We also see multiple scenes shot in the Abruzzo Mountains, further amping up the film's production value. A lot of the conflicting opinions on this film arise from the fact that although it's beautifully shot with lots of attention to detail, the dialogue has been described as nothing short of moronic. Top that off with the unbelievably bad acting of the two leads, and you practically have a recipe for disaster. Regardless of these aspects, the film is now remembered as one of the most iconic additions to the genre from the 80s and has achieved something of a cult status in today's film circles. Many seem to enjoy the shameless displays of abs and sweaty, grimy bodies, even when paired with the silly dialogue, making it a must-watch for fans of bad sword and sorcery moves. Stalker, 1983. Also called El Cazador de la Muerte, Stalker gave birth to three other terrifyingly B-grade sequels that did their best to top the completely unserious and crazed vibes of the original. Released back in 1983, this Argentinian-American film started off just like the others in its genre as a bad Conan ripoff. Debuting in this film is a name you might be familiar with, Lana Clarkson, a woman who went on to become one of the most recognizable faces in B-grade films of the decade. The film shows us the life and journey of a character who calls himself the Death Stalker, who's sent out on a quest to find a mysterious bunch of things, namely a sword, a chalice, and an amulet that must be recovered from the clutches of an evil and powerful magician named Munkar. A certified hit at the box office, Deathstalker became one of the few iconic and successful Conan copies. The film was shameless in its humor, filled with crass jokes and slapstick comedy, but it's also chock full of bad acting and truly terrible editing. Featuring multiple graphic scenes of assault and bloody violence, this sword and sorcery B-movie is one for the R-rated history books. Deathstalker 2: Duel of the Titans, 1987. The second entry in the Deathstalker franchise was even more unhinged than the original, not even pretending to be a serious movie and throwing all semblance of originality to the wind. Much like its other B-grade counterparts, this is in no way a serious watch. If anything, it's more of a guilty pleasure featuring a ton of violence and nudity. The movie centers around a thief named Deathstalker who's really good at bedding women and raiding ancient temples. He sets his eyes on the beautiful princess named Rena, and that's basically when all hell breaks loose. An evil dude named Jarek uses her soul to create a doppelganger with dubious morals in an attempt to get his grimy hands on the throne. The movie is entirely unserious from start to finish, with even the actors getting a good laugh out of it. It's so bad that it's good, and we guarantee you'll be completely enthralled by the absolutely unhinged series of circumstances that the movie stumbles its way through. That might even be its USP, the fact that it is so unabashedly unoriginal that it feels less like a bloody sword and sorcery movie and more like an R-rated parody. Its unashamed copycatting makes it stand out, and we think this will make it a great introduction for those new to the genre. The Warrior and the Sorceress, 1984. This Argentine-American sword and sorcery film from 1984 draws inspiration from the gore novels and Kurosawa's Yojimbo to create a truly beautiful and steamy standout in the genre. Originally named Dark Sword of Thor, which was then changed to Kane of the Dark Planet before the makers settled on the final name, this movie is pretty unique in more ways than one. For example, not many B-grade films took inspiration from cinematic masterpieces like Yojimbo. Secondly, and more importantly, Maria Socas is always topless. And by that, we mean literally always. Yeah, the movie's cult status and popularity are starting to make sense now, aren't they? Oh, and it's not just her. Many of the other actresses wear barely anything. You don't even have to look closely. In almost every scene, there's someone guaranteed to be topless around. Apparently, the director was practically obsessed with her body, which is what spurred him to create a costume design that reflected his tastes. The movie didn't become a cult classic because of the nudity, although that definitely played a big part. It has excellent sword fight scenes as well, which is undoubtedly an essential aspect of this genre. It isn't a great movie by any means, but it is entertaining, especially since the director quit before the film was finished. The movie is pretty choppily edited in places, matching the rest of its B-grade vibes. It's not the most amazing movie, but it is a fun and steamy time, and you probably won't regret it. The Sword of the Barbarians, 1982. Also known as Sangreal and the Sword of Fire, this 1982 film revolves around the life of Sangreal, the heir to King Aetor's kingdom. His kingdom is swept into sudden danger when the evil Nantuk takes it upon himself to take it down. Sangreal helps his people escape the devastated village and search for a new home, all while doing his best to avenge them. Featuring scenes of violence and bloodshed, this is a classic sword and sorcery film that lovers of the genre will enjoy. One fun fact you might not know about it is that in a true low-budget fashion, the village raiding scene from this film was reused in an Italian movie that was released the next year. Pretty crazy, huh? Hearts and Armor, 1983. Almost everyone who loves sword and sorcery films knows that Italy is practically the home ground of the genre, having churned out such films for the greater part of the 80s and 90s. Hearts and Armor is another such fantasy flick based sometime back in the Dark Ages. Inspired by the Italian epic Orlando Furioso, it does a somewhat crazed job of adapting the original work. It lies somewhere between a melodrama and an action film, playing out the story of two intense lovers against an action-centric backdrop. We meet a woman named Bradamante who has a suit of armor that came to her as a sort of reward after she successfully managed to evade her assaulters once upon a time. The film follows her journey as she gets wrapped up in a crazy love triangle, or whatever shape you'd like to call it, considering how it involves a concerning number of knights and other fighters of all sorts. A crazy amount of lovers might mean a crazy number of steamy scenes, right? Well, you'll have to watch this B-grade bomb to find out. Conquest, 1983. This Italian-Mexican dark fantasy film from 1983 was initially named Mace, Il Fiorlaghi. Its plot revolves around a young boy named Ilias, whose journey to manhood is fraught with terrible battles and dark journeys. He battles a multitude of mutants and monsters through the course of the film, making for some truly epic, bloody, and violent battle scenes. A mad mix of Conan the Barbarian and Indiana Jones, this movie takes B-grade copies to the next level by picking up the best of both worlds and clustering it all up into the most haphazard and gory mix ever. The film's low budget doesn't stop it from experimenting with everything from mutants to zombies on screen, making it pretty high in entertainment value, especially if you know what to expect from a B-grade movie of this genre. The enormous amounts of gore in the fight scenes make it a watch that could be worth your while. Unfortunately, to no one's surprise, the film bombed at the box office. Let us know if you've ever watched it or if you ever plan on watching it anytime soon. Amazons, 1986. Based on Aguibe's Sword, Amazons was an Argentine-American co-production that was basically a bunch of super steamy, barely clothed scenes with a bare-bones plot masquerading as a blend of sci-fi, fantasy, and adventure in a sword and sorcery epic. Shot almost entirely in Argentina with an entirely Argentinian crew, the film follows a tribe of devilishly beautiful women from a time unknown, women whose lives and spirits are tied to a bunch of magical trees. That's a real recipe for disaster. These women live together in a community that's being looted and plundered by King Kalungo's army. The villainous king gets much of his power from what we only know as the Weird Ways and a demonic entity known only as Balgor. The film doesn't have much to offer other than beautiful and barely clothed women warriors who prance around on screen in skimpy iron bikinis and battle the occasional enemy. The story isn't the greatest, with more focus being apparently placed on casting the most attractive bunch of women that the makers could get their hands on. But it's not like we can complain, right? There's not much else we can expect, so if anything, the film gives you exactly what you want to see when you watch it. Sorceress, 1982. Inspired by the success of Conan, The Sorceress is yet another steamy sword and sorcery film released in 1982. We begin the story by being introduced to the villain, Trigon, an evil sorcerer who will do anything to keep himself powerful. He realizes that in order to do so, he must sacrifice his firstborn to some clearly sadistic god. When his wife hears of his intentions, she's horrified and refuses to tell him which one of his twin daughters, Mira or Mara, was born first. She runs off with the girls before he can get to them, begging a poor peasant to raise them as boys so that he'll never be able to lay a finger on them. Now, all of this is enough to tell you that this movie isn't much more than a classic, perhaps slightly dull film in the genre. Nothing new, nothing crazy, but the lead actresses certainly make the movie worth a watch, especially considering the fact they're practically wearing next to nothing for most of the film. Imagine a bunch of Playboy bunnies parading around in armored bikinis and picking delicate sword fights with their enemies, and you've imagined what most of this movie looks like. Now, stop imagining and start watching, because you're not going to want to miss these B-grade bombshells. Barbarian Queen, 1985. Also called Queen of the Naked Steel, this 1985 film was yet another of those infamous B-grade Argentine-American co-productions that we're very familiar with by now. The film transports us to a peaceful, loving barbarian village located smack in the middle of nowhere. As the citizens gather to prepare for the festivities of their Queen Amithia's wedding to Prince Argan, the city is plagued by a sudden attack by the army of Lord Arakur. They brutally assault the women, attack the men, and gather prisoners by the hundreds, including the Queen and the Prince, leaving the village thoroughly plundered and destroyed. The only survivors are the Queen's handmaiden and a lone female warrior, who then take it upon themselves to save their queen, free the citizens of their beloved home, and bring them back to where they rightfully belonged. Oh, and also maybe get a little bit of revenge along the way. Now, obviously this is nowhere close to as good as Conan, but it's got everything you need in a steamy B-grade film, namely beautiful and barely clothed women, ruggedly handsome men, violent and brutal battles, multiple scenes of assault, chained up warrior women, and strangely shaped clothes that reveal it all. What more could one ask for? Barbarian Queen 2, The Empress Strikes Back, 1990. The Barbarian Queen miraculously managed to have a sequel, and this movie is somehow even worse than the first. It feels like a bunch of people just walked into the woods with costumes on and decided to start filming, especially considering the massive downgrade in the quality of the battle sequences. We're first met with the Queen, who wishes to get married again after the last fiasco. She's found a new guy for herself and is all set to marry him. But it's not long before a wrench is thrown into her plans by an evil king who wants her to get him a scepter that only women are able to touch. His daughter seems to be helping the queen escape his clutches, but it's all a trap and she's in on the plan with her dad. She enslaves the queen's boyfriend, abducting him and deciding to make him her future groom so that she can have all of the fun and the queen is left with nothing. Pretty sad, right? Now, this sequel is a classic no-brainer sort of film, filled with time skips to escape the issue of continuity. You can tell the makers were focused on one thing and one thing only, the gorgeous lead actresses. And who wouldn't be? One look at them and you'll realize just what the appeal is. Oh, also there's a gratuitous topless scene of the queen on a torture rack, which really just proves what the creator's actual focus was. Anyways, the film ends with the Barbarian Queen and her fiancé sharing a deserved victory, because that's what we're all watching the movie for, right? Warrior Queen, 1987. Warrior Queen transports us all the way back to Pompeii, 79 AD, where we're introduced to a world where people just casually buy and sell slaves who they find attractive and want to get hot and heavy with. No big deal, right? This softcore fantasy film from 1987 doesn't just stop there either. It tells us the story of a righteous queen who lives among the elite and works secretly to create a better world for everyone in her kingdom, and yes, that includes the slaves. She helps them run off so they can eventually find their freedom and live their own life, sometimes putting even her own life in danger. Unfortunately for her, a film that doesn't have much of a plot to speak of is bound to end early, and so does this one. At the very end, the volcano of Pompeii erupts, and she and the slaves attempt to flee the chaos, and we see them being brutally chased down by the military. And yeah, that's about it for the plot. Nothing too fancy, we know. The highlight of the film, though, isn't the plot, it's the gorgeous semi-nudity that's the real star of the show. Everywhere we look, we see half-naked men and women throughout the film. The Roman decadence is as clear as day, and that same Roman charm and beauty is reflected in the outfits. The acting isn't anything crazy special, but we feel like that's not what anyone was watching the movie for anyways, if you catch our gist. Eat! Hundra, 1983. This Italian-American-Spanish collaboration from 1983 centers around a girl whose name is, you guessed it, Hundra. She belongs to a tribe of Amazons nestled in the middle of nowhere and is the only girl in the entire tribe who's never been intimate with a man. She has no intentions of changing this and prides herself on being untouched. One fine day, a group of barbarians stumbles upon the tribe, hunting and killing every last one of them. To Hundra's horror, she realizes that she's the only hope for the future of the Amazons, and to ensure that her people don't die out, she'll have to bear a child. Well, now isn't that convenient timing? An exciting facet of this film lies in the director's apparent passion for his project, according to the lead actress herself. In an almost entirely nude scene, when she had requested a stunt double, the director had picked one that was so unlike her body type and figure that the actress, to maintain authenticity, was forced to do the whole scene herself. The film is now considered an underrated gem in many film circles and is undoubtedly a must-watch, at least according to us. Thor the Conqueror, 1983. Also known as Thor il Conquistador, this 1983 film is a tale of magic and myth inspired by Conan the Barbarian and Conquest. We're introduced to Thor, a majestic god who fights against all odds to achieve a momentous victory. His father's rival, this guy called Nut, hatches a successful plot to off both his parents, and in an attempt to keep him safe and alive, another god named Tisha hides and raises him in secrecy. Once Thor gets old enough, he sets off on a quest to take back the lands that were rightfully his and avenge his parents' untimely deaths. On his journey, he meets a beautiful warrior woman named Ina and takes her as his wife. And of course, the movie ends with a confrontation with Nut and an eventual victory. Who'd have thought it, right? Another movie that's worth watching only for its steamy costume design and the gorgeous Ina, this movie has a bare bones plotline that's not too hard to follow and a stellarly stunning cast of beauties, making it a good one-time watch.
How interesting.
Wizards of the Demon Sword, 1991. A movie with such a wonderfully strange title is bound to be full of oddities, and Wizard of the Demon Sword doesn't disappoint in that regard. The best way to describe this movie is it's so bad it's good, and the terrible quality of the film just amps up the entertainment value, making it a truly exciting watch. The plot is a bit of a mess, but the easy way to put it is that it revolves around this villainous wizard who calls himself Lord Kura, who has stolen the powerful knife of Akhtar and wants to use it to rule the world. It's classic sword and sorcery plot, not too good, not too bad. We are then introduced to a traveling swordsman named Thane, who bumps into a gorgeous woman named Melina. Coincidentally enough, Melina's dad has been abducted and held hostage by the evil Lord Kura. She asks Thane for help, and he joyfully agrees. Who wouldn't, especially with how gorgeous Melina was? This movie is chock full of the strangest jokes and puns, along with a ton of bloodshed and questionably clothed, busty women. Even the men are barely clothed, prancing around on stage in leotards and intricately designed swords. If you think it sounds terrible, take a leap of faith and give it a watch anyways. You'll be entertained beyond belief within the first 10 minutes if you're anything like us. And if you've seen this one already, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts on this oddball gem in the comments down below. Conclusion. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We hope you enjoyed this super long and hopefully super detailed list of R-rated sword and sorcery films. Let us know if we missed any or if you want us to cover any other genres in a similar vein. If you've watched any of these films thanks to our recommendations, we'd love to know your thoughts. Regardless of how good or bad these films are or how well they did at the box office, they're icons of the era and cannot be ignored. It'd be a real shame if we forgot about the existence of these hidden gems, wouldn't it? Of course, if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already.